Now we are going to continue to look at the idea of sense restraint and how to actually do this in practice. And to kind of set the stage, set the scene for this, I'm going to first of all, have a look at the sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya on page 26 in your little booklet there. So if you can please turn to page 26. And this is the suttas on two powers. And the sutta goes as follows from the Anguttara Nikaya too. Because there are these two powers. What two? The power of reflection and the power of development. Yeah, so two powers. One is the power of reflection. It's quite interesting that the power of reflection is mentioned in this way. And what is the power of reflection? Here someone reflects thus: bodily misconduct has a bad result in the present life and the future life. Verbal misconduct has a bad result in the present life and in the future life. Mental misconduct has a bad result in the present life and in the future life. Having reflected thus, he abandons bodily misconduct and develops good bodily conduct. He abandons verbal misconduct and develops good verbal conduct. He abandons mental misconduct and develops good mental conduct. He maintains himself in purity. This is called the power of reflection here. Yeah, so this is all about the things that we have been looking at so far, about how to develop virtue, morality, how to do the right things. Misconduct here just means basically bad virtue, right? Anything which is inappropriate, really, from a Buddhist point of view, is what is meant here by misconduct. It sounds almost a little bit funny in English in this way, but even like if you think something and the thought is a thought of anger or desire, it will come under misconduct here. It's a very kind of high bar for what is required, what is considered misconduct. So what this is saying really is that the way to overcome all of these negative things is to reflect about them in the right way, to understand that they are a problem, right? It leads to bad results in the present life and the future life. What this is saying is that these things are problematic. And if you understand that these things, they carry with them suffering, problems, and we'll see more of these problems in a second, because the next sutta is also about these things. This is the way to overcome these negative qualities of body, speech and mind, by reflecting in the right way. It doesn't say here by meditation, it doesn't say here by anything else. It says really using wisdom power, these things actually disappear as a consequence. That is what this is saying. So, and then it says at the very last there, you maintain yourself in purity. And of course, purity again here has all to do with defilements, right? So defilements are abandoned, the 5 hindrances are abandoned. All of these things are overcome more so through reflection than through any other way. How we think about these things, just looking at things from a slightly different perspective, is the difference between anger and not getting angry. A slight different perspective is the difference between desire and an even mind, which is not ruffled by these things. Yeah, and that's all it is. It's a change in perception, a change of way of looking at the world. That is all it is really required. Of course, meditation can also be helpful to some extent, but it is the reflection that goes with the meditation, comes afterwards, the way we think about it, that really is the crucial issue here. So very, I think, interesting point, and it kind of, again, it supports the idea that it is wisdom power in the end that matters rather than anything else, whether it is meditation or willpower. None of those are right. It is reflection that is the right way. So this is called the power of reflection. And what is the power of development? This is the bhavana bala. Power here is bala, like the 5 powers. Bhavana, often bhavana is like translated as a meditation into English, but often it actually has a much more, sometimes it has a more meaning than that, but here it has a very specific meaning. What does it mean? Here, a bhikkhu or anyone else develops the awakening factor of mindfulness that is based upon seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, maturing in release. He develops the awakening factor of discrimination of phenomena, the awakening factor of energy, the awakening factor of piti, rapture, the awakening factor of passaddhi, tranquility, the awakening factor of stillness, samadhi, the awakening factor of evenness of mind or equanimity, upekkha, that is based upon seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, maturing in release. This is called the power of development. These bhikkhus are the two powers. So the second one here, the power of development, this is all about meditation practice, right? Starting off there with the awakening factor of mindfulness. We had a long discussion of these awakening factors just the other night. So starting off with mindfulness, which already is meditation practice really, and then the development of the higher aspects of meditation, the joy, the energy, moving on towards the jhanas, right, the samadhi factor and the equanimity factor. So this is the meditation part. So development is meditation, but prior to that, remember what we have been talking about all along is the idea that you need to have sila, you need to have that purity of the mind before meditation really is possible. If you have too much desire, aversion, all these kind of problems, it's not going to enable you to stay in the present moment, because these qualities, by their very nature, they draw you into the past and draw you into the future. And only by abandoning them first is development possible. So the development here really is about samadhi, and to be able to do that, first of all, you have to reflect wisely to get there. So again, meditation doesn't come about just by sitting enough, right? By closing your eyes and just meditating. Meditation comes about through practicing the whole path. And in particular, as we see here, practicing reflection and wisdom in the right way. This is how meditation itself is actually developed. A simple little sutta, but I think very important. It occurs a number of times, this sutta, with slight variations, but essentially it's pointing towards the same thing here. Now we're going to come to one of my suttas that I think are very useful for considering how to think in the right way. And this is on the next page, page 27, Majjhima Nikaya number 19. The two kinds of thoughts, the Dveda Vitakka Sutta, if you want to look it up yourself. And this is again an extract, but it's one of those very, to me, very meaningful suttas. It shows us a lot on what needs to be done in terms of thinking in the right way and how to deal with the thinking mind. So, this is how it goes. Thus have I heard, right? Evang me sutang, the beginning of almost all the suttas. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in the Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they replied, and the Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, before my awakening, while I was still only an unawakened bodhisattva, it occurred to me, suppose I divide my thoughts into two classes. Then I set on one side thoughts of sensual desire, or thoughts imbued with sensual desire, if you like, thoughts affected by ill will, and thoughts affected by harming or cruelty or something like that. And I set on the other side thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of non-ill will, or mental states imbued with non-harming. Then, as I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute. And I will stop there, because now we're getting into some much more detail. I want to just have a look at that first paragraph, or first two paragraphs, first of all. So, there's many interesting things happening here straight away. And one of those interesting things is that the Buddha starts off by saying, before my awakening, while I was still an unawakened Bodhisattva, right? And first of all, it is interesting here that the Buddha is talking about before his own awakening. Obviously, what this sutta is all about is learning how to deal with the thinking mind. So what he's talking about here is what he did, right? This is how I practiced. And this is what I was saying, I think, on one of the first days here, that the Buddha, very often, he inspires the monks and inspires the lay people by telling them how he practiced this path. Right? And that is why it is so important to understand that the Buddha was human just like everyone else. If the Buddha was not human, if he was some kind of superior being that is untouchable for the rest of us, then his path is kind of irrelevant to us, because obviously if you are something else, then you have a different path. The very fact that he is human is what makes this significant and makes this important. So it's very important to think about the Buddha in the right way. I don't mean to depreciate the Buddha at all. On the contrary, what I mean is to respect him, but for the right reasons and not for the wrong reasons. This is so important, because this is how he teaches us. So that is the first thing there. The second thing, of course, he talks about being an unenlightened bodhisattva. Right? And many of you will think, oh, but I thought there was no bodhisattvas in Theravada Buddhism. What is this doing in the suttas? Right? Here he's calling himself a bodhisattva. So maybe there are bodhisattvas in Theravada Buddhism. Do you think there are bodhisattvas in Theravada Buddhism, or is that just in Mahayana Buddhism? Actually, there is bodhisattvas everywhere. And this is, I think, perhaps one of the problems in some way. There are bodhisattvas in Theravada Buddhism, in Mahayana, and probably other places as well. But the point here is that these things have different meanings depending on where they are used, in what kind of text they occur. And this is important to understand. What exactly is the meaning in this particular context? This is what really is the crucial issue here. Of course, in later Buddhism, the Bodhisattva means somebody who has been practicing for eons and eons and eons to become a Buddha, having had the bodhicitta. The bodhicitta is the mind of awakening, and now you're kind of heading towards awakening ultimately down the line, and you want to become a Buddha for the benefit of all living beings. And that whole idea of a bodhisattva like that is a later development that happened after the Buddha started to pass away. There's a very nice booklet called The Origin of the Bodhisattva Ideal, or something like that, written by Venerable Analayo. It's available online for free if you're interested. I think it's called The Origin or the Provenance or the something like of the Bodhisattva Ideal. And it talks about how the Bodhisattva ideal arises, the ideal of practicing for many eons and these kind of things. And it traces the very beginnings of this back to the suttas, back to the idea of Maitreya, which is mentioned in one sutta in the Pali Canon, right? And a few other instances like that. Also in the Chinese translations of the suttas, the Agamas, you find one or two mention of these things. And it traces it from there until you get the fully fledged Bodhisattva ideal, which is later, which is not actually found in the suttas at all, is found in the commentaries and these kind of things. And one of the things that I find interesting is that it's sort of natural that these sort of ideas, they arise. They arise when the Buddha passes away. I'm sure you can imagine what it would have been like to be a disciple of the Buddha at that time, right? And the Buddha passes away. Imagine the Buddha, one of these extraordinarily powerful, charismatic figures. The person you go to every time you have a spiritual question, you go to the Buddha and say, "Master, please, I have this problem. What can I do?" And he kind of lays it out in beautiful way, right? And suddenly this master disappears. He is gone. How do you feel? You feel empty. You feel at a loss. And we were just we were just reading the Mahaparinibbana Sutta a little bit before, and we didn't read everything there, but later on there are people are crying, right? They're tearing out their hair, as it says there, and there are all of these things because they are so upset by the fact that the Buddha is now gone. There's a massive vacuum happening in the middle of the Sangha and also for the lay people. The Buddha has disappeared. And of course, when that vacuum is there, that is when people start to think they want to replace that vacuum with something. At the very least, we want to have a proper biography of the Buddha. We want to understand who the Buddha was. So far, the only thing that you really have are a few fragments of biography scattered about in the suttas here and there, and those fragments are themselves very revealing for who the Buddha was. But it wasn't enough. People wanted something more, something tangible they could hold on to when the Buddha was physically absent. Some literature, something like that instead. And from that, you get the arising of the Bodhisattva ideal, the expansion of the idea of who the Buddha was, right? And it moves from fairly innocuous things like the idea of Maitreya arising in the future, the idea of kind of making a commitment through under a Buddha way in the past, Dipankara Buddha, 28 Buddhas ago, and it builds up on that until it becomes more and more supernatural, more and more far removed from the very down-to-earth descriptions that you find in the early discourses. Early discourses really down-to-earth. The further away you come from the Buddha, the more kind of highfalutin and kind of astonishing are the stories about the Buddha. He becomes more and more kind of outlandish, right? I can't remember now very clearly how it goes, but one of the very famous Mahayana sutras is the Prajnaparamita Sutra, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutta. And if you read the Prajnaparamita Sutra, I have not read these things fully at all, but I've read little bits and pieces here and there just to kind of educate myself a little bit on what these things are about. And you read the opening statement in the Prajnaparamita Sutta, and there's 10 pages of just miracles and wonders, and how through, how through every pore of the Buddha's body was projected other realms with other Buddhas that were teaching other Buddhas within each of these realms, and it's magnificent things, right? With a completely outlandish and really sort of out there. So you see how this development happens over the centuries, becoming more and more speculative, more and more imaginative, more and more the kind of things that people, maybe they have seen some of these things in their meditation practice, because sometimes the mind can create these things, and then eventually you get these enormous elaborations. So to me, the more simple things are, the more down to earth they are, the more they fit with the early Buddhist texts, the Nikayas and the Agamas, the more I take these things to be realistic and real depictions of the Buddha. So this is the emergence of the Bodhisattva ideal, right? This is how it kind of comes about. And then you come to Mahayana Buddhism, where you're supposed to become a Buddha. Then you come to the Tantrayana, Vajrayana Buddhism, where you get even the fast way of getting to Buddhahood, and all of these kind of things developing upon each other. And some of the things that you read there may very well be useful and good. I don't want to denounce these things kind of out of hand. That is also, I think, a wrong way of looking at it. But certainly, sometimes it does not match very well with the early Buddhist ideas and thoughts. So what then, having then had a little bit of a look at the historical development of the Bodhisattva ideal, not very kind of systematically at all, but just off the top of my head, so to speak, what then does Bodhisattva mean in the early suttas? And what it means, if you look at where it is used and how it is always used in connection with the Buddha's autobiography, when he talks about himself and his own thing. And he uses it after he goes forth from the home life into homelessness, right? The moment he leaves the home life, before he reaches awakening, you're talking about a few years of practice only, that is when the Buddha really is the Bodhisattva. And there's a very good reason for why that is the case. This is not 100%, what I'm telling you now is not 100% the complete picture, because it's also used in a couple of places in different ways from that. It is used in the Acharya Abhuta Sutta that we talked about the other day, the marvelous and wonderful qualities surrounding the birth of the Buddha. It is also used there. But this is like Acharya Buddha Sutta is already moving a little bit in the realm of, exalting the Buddha beyond what is natural, and it has certain qualities to it that I think there's quite a bit of additions and things going on there. It doesn't fit very well with the way this is depicted in the Agamas, in the equivalent sutta in the Agamas. There's lots of inconsistencies there. So I must admit I don't take that sutta quite as seriously as I take the other suttas. So generally speaking, looking aside from some of those slightly unusual places, generally speaking, it's after the Buddha goes forth from the home life that he's called a Bodhisattva in the suttas. So what does it mean? And what it means is usually it is said to be equivalent to the Sanskrit word bodhisattva, which means something like awakening being, which is kind of a little bit strange to my ears, awakening being. But there is an alternative explanation for the meaning of the word bodhisattva, and that was proposed by Professor Richard Gombrich, and I just got an email from him yesterday actually. It was quite strange, out of the blue. This is kind of one of the weird things of being a monastic, is that Professor Richard Gombrich, who is a professor of Sanskrit at Oxford University. He was a professor for 30 years or something, or 35 years or whatever it was. He was professor of Sanskrit at Oxford University. Now he is retired, right? And is running the Oxford Center for Buddhist Studies. And I have had some contact with him because of publishing some articles and that kind of thing. But he is like the very top of academia internationally when it comes to Pali and Sanskrit and these kind of things. And then the other day, I get an email from him, and he asks me a question about Pali. That is so strange. That is so very, very strange, because he is the professional. He really knows these things inside out. I'm just like one of these people dabbling a little bit in kind of Pali and languages, right? It was very, very strange when that happens. Overall, his knowledge base is, of course, very great, but there's something about being a monastic, when you live these texts and you're close to these texts, that gives you perhaps a different perspective, that even people at the very top of academia, they can find that useful sometimes to hear that perspective. I was quite astonished when I got this email. Only 2 days ago it came to me, do you have any opinions about this Pali passage? But anyway, now I'm quoting him instead, right? So we had to quote each other a little bit. And what he is saying, which is interesting, because his understanding of Sanskrit is obviously very, very good, and he's saying that one possibility for this word bodhisattva is that it comes from the Sanskrit word bodhisakta. And bodhisakta has a slightly different meaning from bodhisattva. Sakta has the idea of being intent on, pursuing, aiming at. So this means the person who is intent on awakening. Right? And that kind of makes far better sense to me than the awakening being, the person who is intent on awakening. I know that my friend Venerable Ajahn Sujato, he is now translating bodhisattva in that particular way, being intent on awakening here. Or the person, the one who is intent on awakening, if you like. And of course, then you can see why it fits in so well with the Buddha biography, right? Because the moment the Buddha leaves his home life, after he has been kind of living the pleasures of the home life for a number of years, at that moment, that is when he is intent on awakening, right? He decides, I'm going to leave the homeless life behind. Now I'm going to search for an end to death and all the problems in the world. So that to me is why what we see here. So the bodhisattva is the bodhisattva, the one who is intent on awakening after he then leaves the home life. And that to me makes very, very good sense. And it fits with the way the suttas and the agamas and all of these kind of things actually work out. So that is a little bit about the bodhisattva. And we're going to have to move on because I'm taking a little bit too much time here with things that are not entirely relevant, but it's kind of interesting anyway. I hope you find these things interesting. If you find these things really terribly boring and irrelevant, then please write a note and say, please go faster or something like that, and then we can see what we can do about it. So then, now he starts talking about what he did as a bodhisattva, right? How he practiced. And this is how he practiced. He said, suppose I divide my thoughts into two classes, two categories. On the one side, I set all the bad thoughts, the unwholesome thoughts, thoughts that are connected with sensual desire, thoughts connected with ill will, and thoughts connected with cruelty. Cruelty here is ahimsa. Ahimsa means like being callous, being ruthless, being inconsiderate, being harmful to other beings. Not necessarily that you have ill will, but the fact that you are harming other beings because you don't really care, right? You are ruthless in a sense. You kind of walk down the streets, lots of insects there, you don't care if you trample those insects. You don't really have any ill will to them, you just don't give a damn about those insects. That's what it kind of comes down to. Excuse my language. So that is this thoughts on one side, and on the other side you have the opposite thinking, which is renunciation, which means giving up sensuality, non-ill will, giving up the ill will, and giving up the cruelty, the harmfulness, the callousness towards other beings. Right? So this is one of the first things that the Buddha does. And you may think that this is kind of obvious, perhaps. Perhaps you think this is easy, right? But actually, it is not as easy as it seems. Because the point here, of course, is that the Buddha, or the Buddha to be, that is actually what he is now, the Buddha to be, when he does this, he doesn't just do it in a superficial way, but it does it all the way down to the very bottom of what is wholesome and what is unwholesome. And this is what is so difficult. We can all know anger when it really arises and becomes strong. It's very obvious that we are angry or upset about something. We can very easily see strong desires in our mind. These things are very obvious. But remember that these things come in manifestations, they come in degrees that are very refined, very, very, very refined degrees, right? And this is where it becomes hard. So when you are practicing your meditation, sometimes you get disturbed. And the reason why you are disturbed is because of these very, very refined elements of these 5 hindrances. In fact, the 5 hindrances aren't really gone until just before you enter the jhana states. Prior to that, there's still going to be some refined degree of those hindrances left in your mind. So this is why this sounds kind of easy and obvious on the surface, but actually it is more complex than actually you would think. And it's something that we learn on the Buddhist path, right? Gradually understanding our mind fully enough so we're able to divide the world into good thoughts on the one hand and the unskillful ones on the other hand. And as we do that and we learn these things, then we're able to make gradual progress. So we start with what we can see already and we work on that, and as we become more, the mind becomes more refined, you work on the secondary layers of defilements and eventually on the very refined layer of defilements at the very bottom. And there is actually a nice sutta which talks about precisely that. It's called the Goldsmith Sutta or the Gold Refiner Sutta in the Anguttara Threes. So, soil remover. It's called that's right. Yeah, okay. It's called the soil remover sutta, but it has the goldsmith in it, or the gold. That's exactly how it is. The soil remover. You remove the soil from the gold first of all, and then you refine it gradually down. Anguttara 3 is 100, I think it is. So this is what you do, and this is why this is interesting. And then the interesting part here is that he then says, as I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute. Right? So these words, diligent, ardent, and resolute, these are kind of words that you hear a lot in Buddhism. The Pali words are appamada, atapi, and pahitatta are the words. And appamada, I'm sure most of you will know that word already. And usually it is translated as heedful, right? You are heedful about things. And diligent to me means more like you are really working hard, that sort of thing. But it's more heedful in the sense that you are careful, you are circumspect, right? You think carefully, you reflect carefully before you do things and how you do things. Appamada, heedfulness. Ardent means energetic, you have energy, you put forth a certain amount of effort. And resolute is similar to that. Pahitatta is related to the word padana, which is the 6th factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, right effort. So it basically just means that you are careful, you are circumspect, and you put forth the right kind, and you put forth effort in these things. So, of course, interesting, right? That straight away here we see that as I abided in this way, heedful, energetic, and with effort. So it refers back to what has just been said. So being heedful here, being energetic, having effort, means precisely the dividing of your thinking mind into two classes. Isn't that kind of interesting? That is what heedful means, right? The ability to divide your mind in this way. And of course, why that is so interesting is because it shows us that that ability to divide your mind into two classes is precisely about wisdom, right? This is what is going on here. You're reflecting on your mind and pulling it apart in such a way you can see the good qualities and the bad qualities. So having effort, being energetic, being heedful, again, you can see right here, is about wisdom power rather than using willpower, anything like that. And these are the things that I've just been talking about before. I'm just pointing these things out to you as we go through this. It's kind of obvious once you see it, but sometimes when you read through the sutta, you don't get these things straight away, right? It took me 20 years to see these things, and I'm not kind of helping you to kind of shortcut your path a little bit. It doesn't have to take you 20 years to find these things. It's amazing often how long it takes to kind of grasp some of these fairly... when you see them, they're obvious, but they're not so obvious if you don't. Okay, so this is what he does. And then we can move on. So, as I abided thus diligent, ardent, irresolute, a thought of sensual desire arose in me. I understood thus, this thought of sensual desire has arisen in me. This leads to my own affliction and suffering, to others' affliction and suffering, and to the affliction and suffering of both. It obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from Nibbana. When I consider this leads to my own affliction, it subsided in me. When I considered this leads to the suffering of others, it subsided in me. When I consider this leads to the suffering of both, it subsided in me. When I considered this obstructs wisdom, causes difficulties, and leads away from Nibbana, it subsided in me. Whenever a thought of sensual desire arose in me, I abandoned it, removed it, did away with it. So here, what the Buddha is doing, he's showing us how to overcome unwholesome thoughts, right? He removes it, abandons it, does away with it. And the first, straight away, what you see, of course, when you see all of these methods that he's talking about different ways, they are all about one thing, about how you reflect about these things, right? So it's all about using wisdom, using our kind of skillful means and understanding to overcome these unwholesome thoughts. He doesn't say a word here about suppression or using willpower. It's all about using wisdom, thinking about these things in the right way. Right? For this reason, very interesting, this particular passage. So the first thing he does when the thought of sensual desire arises, well, the first thing that is interesting here, I should maybe point out straight away, this is the Buddha to be, right? This is the person who's become the Buddha in the world, one of the wisest people around, who's able to penetrate this teaching through his own wisdom. He says here, thought of sensual desire arose in me. Right? This is the Buddha talking here, the Buddha to be talking here. And this is kind of nice to remember, right? So when you have a thought of sensual desire, remember you are not alone. You are in very good company. Even the Buddha to be had this problem before his awakening, right? And it has two wonderful consequences of that. The first wonderful consequence is that you don't feel so bad when you have some of these defilements arising in you. It was happening to the Buddha to be. He also, we will see further down, had ill will sometimes, right? And harming, even the Buddha to be. So you feel more, okay, it is acceptable. I don't have to judge myself so harshly. Let me instead find a way of overcoming this. This is the first thing, and it's very beautiful. If we judge ourselves, if we tend to block it out, we can't really look at it with a neutral way anymore. And because we can't look at it in a neutral way, it becomes more difficult for us to overcome these defilements. So it's much better not to judge yourself and just kind of see, okay, this is happening. Now what am I going to do about this? That is really the best approach. And so this is the first thing that comes out of this. And the second thing, of course, that comes out of this again is this idea of the Buddha to be, and the Buddha really being, at the end of the day, a human being just like the rest of us. He too had these kind of defilements, right? And that is, I think, a very important thing to keep in mind. And then the first thing he understands, the thought of sensual desire has arisen. Right? And again, this is what I was saying just before. This is not as simple as it may seem, because sensual desire has a lot of degrees to it. Remember, this has all to do with everything in the realm of the five senses, often very minor things. It can be just holding on to the fact, I want to see, right? Because you want to see, you are attached to seeing. Your mind cannot really go into samadhi because you are still holding on to this attachment to the ability to see. You can't really let go of sight and the eye faculty entirely. Little things like that, right? Which are part of these thoughts of sensual desire. It's important to remember the breadth of these things. So, this is the first thing. He understands these things, even, of course, in the minor ways when they arise. And then comes the way he thinks about this. This leads to my own affliction, right? In other words, he understands why it is a problem, why sensual desire is a problem. This is what he is understanding here. And once you understand that sensual desire, in whatever degree it is, leads to suffering for himself, then you abandon it, right? And so what this means is that for us, what it means is that the more deeply we can reflect on these defilements, the more ability we have to see clearly that there is suffering involved with these kind of things, the more easy it is for us to abandon these things, right? That's really what it means. Now, as far as sensuality is concerned, it's quite hard to see why this is dangerous, because it seems like an innocent thing. We're just enjoying ourselves, just having a bit of entertainment, just the pleasures of the world. How can that be a major problem? And this is why it can be hard to see. So it takes quite a bit of reflection to understand why sensuality is a problem. And in many ways, it is more important, obviously, for monastics, because for a monastic, it is more, you are leaning away from those things in a more serious kind of way, and it can cause a lot of trouble for you if you don't lean away from those things. So more important for monastics, but I think it is important for everybody to at least have some idea of the danger of these things. And as you do that, you tend to move away from that. And so how does this happen? How is it that the mind moves away from something when it sees suffering? And there's one very simple simile that I always use to explain that, because I think it kind of gives the idea very clearly. And that is the idea, in your house you probably have a hot plate, right? Where you boil the water or you cook or something like that. And sometimes somebody may have turned on that hot plate and you don't know that it is on. So you walk around the house and by accident you put your hand on the hot plate. Right, oops, exactly, painful. And you don't have to think, should I remove my hand or not, right? No need to think that at all. It's an automatic reaction. You just withdraw your hand straight away because there's something inside of you that knows this is dangerous, this is suffering, this is a problem. Yeah, and it's exactly the same thing. If you fully understand that sensual desires are a problem, you don't really have to think about it. You don't have to reflect about it. It is an automatic reaction that your mind turns away from those things and is not interested in them. Turns away, goes in a different direction, goes towards peace and tranquility instead. So this is the ideal, and this shows you the power of wisdom. When wisdom is really developed, when you see these things clearly, that is the power. Your mind just turns away all by itself. There's nothing much you have to do. The reality, of course, it takes a long time to get to that point. I think probably you need some high degree of samadhi already to be able to understand these things, because once you get into samadhi, that is the first time you actually have seen sensuality properly for what it is. Prior to that, you won't really understand it properly. So we have to approximate, and because we have to approximate to the truth, we have to reflect on it. What are the problems with these things? Why do they cause difficulties for me? And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later on, but just to give you some ideas what the problem with sensuality is. One of the problems of sensuality is that very often just behind sensuality is also ill will. Ill will and sensuality very often go hand in hand. Why? Because when we enjoy the sensual world, we become attached to things, we hold on to things, and if those things we are attached to get taken away from us, which eventually will, very often we either feel ill will, or we feel sad, or we feel some kind of problem in that particular connection, right? So sensuality and ill will are very closely related to each other. So sometimes all you have to do is understand the danger in ill will, which is much easier to understand, and then you can see why sensuality is also a problem. This is one way of looking at sensuality. Another way, another way, just very briefly, is that sensuality is the one thing that ties you to the wheel of samsara, to birth and death, more than anything else. Because sensuality is always about craving. Craving is what drives you in samsara, what ties you to the round, the thing that projects you into the future, always going on to something else in the future. So craving, as long as you are immersed in sensuality, you're also very powerfully tied to the wheel of existence, to samsara. So if you have a little bit of understanding of the problem of samsara, then you also understand the danger of sensuality, because it ties you down in that respect. Okay, it's already 11:30, so I'm going to have to stop there, but we will come back and continue this later on, so we'll see you again at 2 o'clock.